So how's it going? I really appreciate your critique. I think it was very interesting. You spoke a lot about, larger public institutions that have Greek life. And I know you mentioned Williams, but what about like the schools such as, Lafayette, maybe Lehigh, Bucknell, Union, these schools that have Greek life that honestly like empower the students that have GPAs higher than, men's Greek life here. I know at Lafayette, I can't speak across similar colleges, have a higher GPA than other students, prepare, have great leaders across campus. I'm just curious, do you still have the same grievances with these type of colleges that run Greek life organizations? And yeah.
I mean, there are definitely examples in the book of smaller colleges that have had, very serious issues. So it's not just big public universities.
Yeah.
Of course, Dartmouth, for instance, is, it's a smaller college, and it has, I think it's like 50% of students are in Greek life, and they, that was Animal House was based on Dartmouth, and the president of Dartmouth was a member of that chapter, and is actually doing a lot of the things that I'm talking about in the book. A lot of the restrictions on drinking, ending, trying to do what Williams did, kind of give an alternative, because even he feels that it's gotten kind of out of control. So I mean, I have no doubt that many people have a great experience. So I think that the GPA thing to me is so interesting, because one of the major things I think that is just better information. So if you go back a generation, one of the problems with fraternities was anti-intellectualism and just bad grades. And fraternities actually now focus on grades. And also, I think really importantly, is you report them publicly. So you can compare one fraternity to another. And I mean, what if you also on the website compared the safety record, the number of alcohol-related hospitalizations, the numbers of reports of sexual assault? If you competed on that, then I think you would make some real progress. And that's really what I'm talking about. I mean, I think that the GPA thing is real. I mean, I will say though that, one of the issues I think you probably need to address is that and I'm not saying this about Lafayette, at a lot of schools, you have wealthier students belong to fraternities, and wealth and grades is sadly very correlated. So it's like you would kind of expect that people who have the means to pay fraternity dues and whatever would probably outperform people who didn't have the same kind of preparation. So you'd kind of have to adjust for that. But all that being said, I think that that's an important aspect, and I would just say just continue it, with other things.
Yeah, thank you again for coming. This
has
been very interesting. So my question is sort of around your research and your own personal experiences. From what my understanding is, you focus mostly on SAE. Is that correct?
That's right, although there are others.
So how would you say, how and why can you, along with your research, categorize all Greek life and all organizations based off of sort of your own research of mostly just one distinct organization in the Greek life system?
Well, the way the book is structured is that sort of each chapter is about an episode at SAE, but the middle of each chapter is really about all fraternities. So there's examples from just about Kappa Alpha and Sigma Chi, everyone is in there. All have had these issues one way or another. And it's often, just journalistically, it's often more interesting to focus on a specific, it's like you'd rather read a biography of one person, and this is like a biography of an organization. I actually don't, and I also, it's also one of the largest fraternities, and I didn't see it, although it had more deaths, I saw it as more like other fraternities than unlike. Because I went to a lot of conferences, and I talked to people who travel different fraternities, and all have gone through periods like SAE has gone through. The Phi Delta Theta, for instance, had a period when it was the deadliest, and they made this change where they cracked down alcohol, and it got better. I don't I think they're actually relatively representative. I mean, every kind of incident or episode that I reported at SAE, you could probably find it in the other.
It almost seems like you're sort of speculating in a sense that I'm sure you could find other organizations with the same issues. My question is, how, and I don't disagree with a lot of the points that you make, but my question is, how is it sort of encompassing all of Greek life, especially, and it goes back sort of to Connor's question of, how do you border the difference between a large school, a small school, a big Greek organization, a smaller Greek organization, and sort of tie it all together into 4 distinct problems with all of Greek life?
Well, I mean, even SAE is not just one organization. It's a national with chapters at large schools and small schools. And so if you talk about like race, for instance, I visited chapters in California that were incredibly diverse. So it really depends. So I do think they are actually relatively representative. And also the research I'm talking about, the social science research about the drinking, about sexual assault, that's all fraternities. Or the research about the tremendous association of drinking problems in later life with living in a chapter, that's not SAE, that's all fraternities. The insurance industry information is all fraternities. At the time that I was looking at it, SAE had the highest insurance rates because they had the worst record. So it showed that there was something to this. It wasn't just anecdotal, because they have access to everything, every claim. After a few years, they were not anywhere near the worst, and others are. So I mean, every organization is different, but if you think about that's the other thing, I mean, think about the fraternity movement, I mean, each chapter is different. I mean, really. So you can find chapters of any fraternity that are not at all dangerous, or chapters that are really dangerous. Or you can find a life cycle. Sometimes what happens is the chapter gets shut down, and then when it starts up, this is what the head of the North American Interfraternity Council told me, the first few years, when the alumni are there and you have really active people who are really interested, and also they know that they're trying to prove something, they're great. They're high grades, they're safe, they're responsible. Then people kind of drift away, and the hazing comes back, and the drinking, and then 7 years later, when everyone forgets what happened, it gets shut down again. I mean, if you look at any fraternity chapter at any college, it's like it gets shut down every almost all of them have been shut down at one time or another. So I think they're more representative than not. But this is also an argument for schools and fraternities to publish more information. One of the reasons that I knew this about SAE is SAE had settled a lawsuit in California where a student had died. And as part of the settlement, they were required to post on their website every episode where they were disciplined. Now, so that gave me a much more insight into SAE, and it made it much easier to do the reporting, but no one else does that. If everybody did that, if everyone was transparent, then we might see that your chapter is fine, you never had a problem. But being open is, I think, part of the solution. But it's a good question.
On this campus, just to paint you a little bit of a picture, similar to other college campuses, there's definitely a danger. There's high-risk drinking, pre-gaming, binge drinking you talked about. It's definitely prevalent on our campus. But also I feel like it could be argued that a lot of the dangers behind our drinking culture is centered around how secretive the culture here at Lafayette is. I would argue that a lot of the Greek life doesn't have good relations with administration, and a lot of these, secretive drinking that I'm talking about is because of the policies in place with administration and public safety. Do you feel like, in your opinion, that if we had more of an open drinking policy on campus that was more regulated and, more open, and administration was actually a part in creating these policies, that there wouldn't be as high of an issue with the high risk drinking?
I mean, that's a really good question that's debated a lot. I mean, first you have to sort of just accept that there's a law. I mean, the school cannot, I mean, they may look the other way, but they can't, I mean, there's a law against underage drinking. And so the school can't really have a policy that says we're okay with that. So there's been a lot of debate about whether raising the drinking age was such a good idea. And so as I was saying, like in the beginning of my college career, it was 18 and drinking was a lot less secretive. And yes, this definitely drove drinking underground. So there have been some college presidents, I think Middlebury and some other places, that have been pushing for raising the drinking age, which would simplify college's life a lot. The president's life, they could just allow it. But that's never going to happen because there is a huge, raising the drinking age. Lowering the drinking age is a huge public health success. I mean, it's saved tens of thousands of lives, and it continues to do it. And you're just not going to get. Raising the I get confused. Raising the drinking age has made an enormous difference, and drinking rates overall among young people have gone down actually dramatically since the raising of the drinking age. So if you did that, it would be easier for colleges, but more people would die. And one thing that's really interesting is one of the few places where problem drinking is on the rise is in colleges, in part because these laws are not enforced. So it's pretty much you have Mothers Against Drunk Driving, which is a very powerful group, and they're, the minute anyone talks about raising the drinking age, they spring into action, and every single public health authority, CDC, everyone says this is a terrible idea. So you're kind of left with, this is how it's going to be, and how do you negotiate it? But it's definitely a challenge. There's no question.
My question pertains to statistics. I was wondering if there's any data from schools that don't have Greek life on the incidence of binge drinking, injury, and death, and sexual assault, and everything that you went into. Mm-hmm. For other student organizations, say like sports teams, is the incident rate similar? Is this a fraternity problem, or is this teenagers like to drink problem? No,
I mean, the research, there's a study that went on really for decades, this Harvard drinking study that looked at all groups and, all colleges. And fraternity men have the highest level of drinking of any group on campus, by far. So, yeah, I mean, it's pretty, and it's not the only study. There are really dozens of studies. It's kind of just a fact. Now, I don't think they compared a school without fraternities to a school with fraternities, but, that is, that is what the research shows.
I was just wondering if there's any data comparing predominantly white schools to African-American schools, because I know that there are African-American fraternities, and from what I can tell, it doesn't seem like drinking is as much of a part of the culture, and I was just wondering if there's any studies on that, if it's something specific about young men getting together and doing whatever they do, or if it's something specific about the culture of white fraternities or just fraternities in general.
I think there is a difference. There's definitely less of a focus of drinking at African-American fraternities. And their number, one is there generally aren't any houses, so that's one thing. And sadly, the hazing at black fraternities, it doesn't involve drinking, but the problem of hazing at black fraternities is physical violence. So it's more, the issues that run into is just people being sort of beaten with paddles, really brutally beaten. The New York Times columnist Charles Blow wrote a book about, autobiography, describes his hazing, and it's really horrific. That is sort of a separate issue, but I think you're right that the drinking isn't nearly as central to the culture.
In reference to your comments about the raising the drinking age, I was surprised to hear you characterize that the raising of the drinking age as having been a public health boon and having saved thousands of lives, in large part to my perception of the common theories that in the United States, the drinking culture, particularly among the 18 to 20-year-old demographic, not among people in college, but not necessarily so, that it's particularly worse in the U.S. because of our higher drinking age, in which a seeming phenomenon in which youth who have not had prior drinking experience indulge in drinking in college as a sort of form of rebellion and particular binge drinking. Certainly environments which Greek life and fraternities would foster particularly. And so I suppose my question is, if you think that lowering your drinking age would perhaps be a public benefit in terms of making drinking more accessible, de-incentivizing or disincentivizing binge drinking at those ages. Yes, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I mean that's often brought up. A couple of things. One is that you can actually, because the way the United States raised the drinking age was really state by state, because what happened, the federal government said you won't, if you don't raise the drinking age, you'll lose federal money. And so, and it kind of phased in over many years. So you can actually see when a state changes the drinking age, the effect on the drunk driving deaths, and it's pretty clear. It's like a natural experiment. So there's not much controversy about that. The question of Europe is, I think Europe, first of all, is often idealized. Huge problems with alcoholism in Europe too. My understanding of the main difference in Europe is that there's much more public transportation, and people generally, younger people, can't afford to have cars. So there's just, I think people drink very heavily, but they probably don't get nearly as much in trouble because of the driving. So, I'm not sure, but the United States is the way it is. People drive. So, and it has been a success. So that's the.
Yes, and however, and to clarify, would you say that perhaps the nature of college campuses in which many or perhaps most of the students do not commute to school would enhance the risk of drinking? Simply in comparing the European example, in which you cite public transportation as a discouragement for binge drinking, comparison with the United States college drinking culture.
Well, I mean, in some ways we're conflating two things. I mean, the anti-drunk driving movement was also like there were a lot of elements of it. There was tougher enforcement, taking drunk driving seriously, and as well as raising the drinking age. And so it was all part and parcel, So, making the activity much more a higher penalty and raising the cost of it. So, I mean, it's a little hard to tease it all out, but it does seem pretty clear that I don't think you're going to find a lot of public health experts saying that the solution to this is to provide more alcohol to young people. I mean, the other thing that you have to think about is that, you would all remember this time, but when I was in high school, it was very, very common. I mean, each year you would have kids die in drunk driving accidents all the time. And because it was much easier for 18-year-olds to get, it's really in high school that a lot of this is a problem. You lower the drinking age to 18, suddenly high school seniors have much more access, and they spread it to the rest of the school. And that's something that at least that just doesn't happen nearly as often. It is much, much harder to gain access to liquor in high school. And I'm sure like everyone will say, yeah, I got liquor in high school or whatever, but when you're talking about public health, you're talking about reducing risk. Clearly some people will drink. Clearly if fraternities had dry chapter houses and no longer had parties, some people would find alcohol. But if there were less, if fraternities didn't have as many parties. The most dangerous fraternities are the ones that have uncontrolled alcohol, 3 or 4 nights a week, and invite everybody in, including high school students. One of the sexual assault the chapter about sexual assault talks about, a Halloween party where, basically a high school girl came with her older sister and was sexually assaulted. It was just horrible. And part of the issue really was, creating an environment where that happens. It's not safe to be providing alcohol in an uncontrolled environment. And the less you can do it, the safer people will be. It's not a fun message though. But
So you mentioned like Alabama. I read the chapter with like Stewart, or that was at Salisbury. But so
Yeah.
in terms of location, so you mentioned Alabama a lot in terms of like the systemic racism, and then you mentioned California has like a large form of diversity. Do you think it's more based on the geography of these chapters as opposed to the actual chapters themselves? Or like SAE is a very southern, I know you mentioned KA and like Pike and SAE. Those are like primarily southern fraternities. And do you think they're just exhibiting like more southern behavior as opposed to fraternal behavior? I was just curious what your opinion is.
I think that the culture of the school makes a huge difference. So there's a huge difference from, University of California and the University of Alabama. But you'll certainly find episodes of some pretty disturbing behavior in northern schools too. Syracuse just had some pretty big issues. So, and KA, for instance, has this sort of history of these Old South parties, and it's pretty much, and they're trying to, their leadership has tried to stamp it out. Actually, it's hard. So yeah, I think they're different places have different cultures. I think you're right.
And then my second question, so Lafayette, you can't go through recruitment until your like second year. Sorry. Do you think that is like incredibly bad? Like, do you think that's like what effect do you think that have? Because again, like Stewart had to go to Salisbury and then like just dove right into it. But like, do you recommend implementing that?
Yeah, I think that's definitely one of the reforms that I recommend, because when I looked at these 60 deaths at all fraternities, so many of them happened to freshmen.
Yep.
And it seems pretty clear that if and I think they start
it's your
sophomore year.
Yeah, so sophomore.
So it just seems like you've adapted, you have a circle of friends, and also you're not joining out of sort of desperation. What I saw at in the Salisbury case is, if you're a freshman and you just don't have a circle of friends, and everyone is telling you that Greek life is it, and then people try to haze you, you feel like you don't have a choice. I have a feeling that once you're a sophomore and you kind of got you might just say no to some of these things, and I think that's an important reform.
So one of our former alumni, who actually happened to be the student body president, one of his big attempts was to kind of combat like classism. So what he actually wanted to do was have the college establish a fund for people that couldn't afford to pay dues, because obviously it's like several $1,000s for fraternities. It's really expensive. What do you think about that? And do you think colleges are sometimes unrealistic in terms of like expectations, but also not being willing to put like funding behind it?
I think scholarships are a really interesting point, because if you do want to have a more diverse group, you sort of have to do that. And I think some schools, I don't know if Lafayette does that, but some schools do allow you to sort of funnel the money that you would get through financial aid, instead of to the residential hall, to the fraternity. So they don't do that here. You can't use that.
I'm talking in terms
They
of
do?
in like strictly like social dues, like so
social
people
dues,
that don't live in the house but are
Okay.
part of the fraternity. And then my second question is, isn't it better to have, like you talked about restarting, kind of like rebuilding college from scratch? Isn't it better to have things on campus than to be off campus, where at least the school has like some semblance of control?
I mean, like recognized fraternities.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah, I think it's much better to have a recognized fraternities. And most of the college presidents I talk to, their big fear is that if they crack down too hard, then the fraternities will go underground, and then they have, I think my sense, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that you really want the recognition. you want to be part of this campus, and it's a pretty big stick to say that we're going to de-recognize you, and that I think is helpful. Once you're underground, there's just nothing. There's a case in the University of Colorado where actually one of the rules that the University of Colorado wanted to do was to defer recruitment, just like you do here. And not just the fraternities, but the national organization, they threatened a lawsuit, they did all this stuff, and what the entire Greek life, to avoid this, just decided to de-recognize. And so now you have all these fraternities that everyone thinks are associated with the school, but are just completely, have no control.
But then, like, going back to the point about like building a college from scratch, then wouldn't it be advantageous to include fraternities?
To include.
Yeah.
I mean,
because then even if it's like unaffiliated organizations, like you're still gonna have groups of people doing stuff, right?
Well, I guess, I mean, if you're talking about like a fund that a college would do to say, I don't know what social dues are, several $100s or whatever. So
well, no, we're talking about how, like, you got asked earlier, like, if you could get rid of all of them, what would you do? And the example you used was talking about like building a university from scratch.
Yeah.
And you said you wouldn't include them. But so this is kind of like following along that same train of thought. Like, what would you do then?
Well, I mean, I think that if you build I mean, my sense is that college is a place where people come to learn from each other as much as from professors, and sort of the more interaction among students, the better. So, I think all things being equal, particularly freshman year, I think, and you do that, I think it's really great when the school sort of randomly assign people and try to do, because, I met people I never would have met that way, and it's just, I think it's an amazing thing. And to the extent that, clearly people then form groups or whatever, I do think, though, that if but you wouldn't have people do that before they, like the minute they step on campus. That's what I was talking about. But you mentioned this idea of funding. I mean, I think if you were to if the school were to provide funding or scholarships, they probably have to do it it'd have to be for every organization. So I also thought there were some national organizations that were raising money, for that, so that, if you make a, you make a bid to somebody and they can't afford it, then they can apply for financial aid, and that would definitely make a difference.
Yeah, that's definitely true. It's more just because it's like a common critique, and then of the school, of like schools in general. So helping in that regard. I know some fraternities do that, but not all of them are like funded equally on the national level. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you again for coming. At like a recent sort of like discussion group we had like last semester, I can't remember if we were talking about it was either Greek life or like loneliness on campus, but a student put forth sort of the perspective, which I hadn't heard before, that at Lafayette specifically, Lafayette dropped I think like 20 spots in like, it was like the Forbes top 100 maybe, and I think it was Andrew, I think he said his thesis was that like isolation on campus and Greek life, which is I think 43% here, was playing a role in sort of Lafayette being rated lower. I have no idea if that's true or accurate whatsoever, but I'm curious sort of on like the national level, what role do you view fraternities and Greek life as playing with regard to like campus climate or average student happiness sort of like statistically?
Well, I think it's clear that Greek life is an appealing draw for people to go to schools. Colleges are very sophisticated marketers, and colleges would not be advertising Greek life so much on websites if it wasn't drawing students. So I think that's the first step to think about. And again, the research does show that people do value their experience while they're at the fraternity and feel a closer connection to their school and sort of more of a feeling of community. So I think probably when you come down to it, that's one of the reasons why they're so popular. You add that to, the career network, which is extremely real, and then to some degree I think the parties, obviously. so I think that's all part of why it changes the climate.
And just as a brief follow-up, do you view that sense of like allegiance and really reporting like fulfillment, etc., as being unique to Greek life, or is that something you think that just from your perspective with your research, can be found in various organizations?
I'm trying to think of, I think Greek life, people do find a very special bond. You feel some people come back to their chapters, and I think they feel that they belong. I mean, I think there are other organizations. I mean, people probably feel that way about their sports team. I mean, I worked for my college newspaper. That was a pretty strong bond, and that was, I think there are people who do theater probably. I think there are many ways to find that bond, but this obviously is special to people, and that's why in some ways I feel it's kind of sad that it has to be associated with some of this other behavior.
So I was curious as to if there was any research that had been done comparing the level of the incidents that you mentioned in your book between fraternities at smaller colleges versus larger colleges. Because when I think of places that are just absolutely massive, like UCF, USF, Penn State, where you have 70,000 students or so at UCF, for instance, you really can't you can't hope to control 70,000 students when there are, I believe, 43 fraternities on campus there. So do you think that, to an extent, these problems are more of a result of the environment, especially, that these fraternities are being placed in, or the fact that they are fraternities themselves?
I think it can be both, but I mean, again, you see these problems at, one of the chapter on the sort of horrific hazing was at Salisbury University, Maryland, which is pretty small, and there's many examples of this happening at smaller colleges. I do think that it also sort of depends on how powerful Greek life is, whether there are other options. I mean, I think what I could go back to Dartmouth. What Dartmouth has been finding is that, similar to I think Williams a long time ago, is that they just want to provide options for people, and that there are actually a fair number of students that they would like who feel that Greek life is so dominant that it's kind of hard not to be Greek. It's like 50%. When you get to like 50%, it's a pretty big decision not to join. I mean, even here, was it 30% or 23%? 23? Okay. So that's a vibrant, large. I think that once you get even to that stage, there's a point where, that's a very big group. It's probably one of the biggest groups of any kind on campus. So has a powerful, makes a powerful difference. And I think what the president of Dartmouth felt is that it had such a big impact that it was affecting recruitment of people who just didn't want to do it. And also the parties were so out of control that there were professors who would not assign homework on Thursday night because they knew that no one would do it. And it was kind of like, okay, and so that's right, never do that. Yeah, Thursday night. So that clearly has some kind of impact. So that's
I'd like to hear your opinion on the relationship between alcohol and sexual assault, in terms of where fraternities fall into that, because you've said a few times that misogyny itself seems to be a pretty big issue for fraternities specifically, and in the general conversation on sexual assault on college campuses overall, alcohol is often cited as the main issue, as opposed to the culture and the toxic ideology of the way women should be treated. What do you think the role of fraternities is in that?
Well, I think alcohol is central to the problem of sexual assault in general, and in fraternities in particular, because there's so much alcohol. And it's sometimes hard to separate that from sort of attitudes, but it's the Justice Department survey that I mentioned earlier talks about, really is looking at incapacitated sexual assault, which is essentially, it's almost always someone who's drunk, and the higher risk for women who frequently go to fraternity parties. And so in that case, it's not 100% clear whether it's the fact that they're fraternities or the fact that there's just so much alcohol and it's done in an irresponsible way. But I mean, in my mind, so you start with trying to reduce the alcohol, right, and to see if that's going to help. There are also a fair number of surveys of fraternity members were asking attitudes about consent, and a lot of them seem to reveal some disturbing results where people who belong to fraternities will usually the questions are asked so that the behavior is not described as sexual assault, but have you ever done X, Y, and Z, or and typically members of fraternities are more likely to describe behavior that amounts to sexual assault. And these surveys are not quite as big as the alcohol surveys, so I'm not quite as confident, but there are a lot of them, and they all seem to show the same thing. And it does sort of, and then you combine it with some of the really disturbing stuff that comes out from time to time, emails. I think one of the really, really interesting examples in Pennsylvania is what happened in Swarthmore. I don't know if you all have followed that. Some activists and the paper found this sort of secret diary, or it was like minutes of the two fraternities there, and published it in the paper. And it was just like this awful screed of just misogyny and racism, and it created this firestorm to the point where the fraternities themselves voted to disband and no longer be associated with it, which I thought was really interesting. It was like, we cannot be associated with this. To me, it showed the power again of information. But these, I know people will say, well, this is an anecdote or whatever, but you'll find you'll find these like offensive signs, offensive parties. There was one in North Carolina where pledge books where they joking about rape. It's like enough comes out, and you combine that with some of these surveys, that you do wonder whether there has to be sort of a look at the culture.
Hi, John. Thanks very much for being here tonight. I'm Jerry Blakesley. I'm a 1970 graduate of Lafayette College. I also happen to be the chapter advisor to the Chi Phi fraternity for the last 10 years. And full disclosure, I'm a member of the Grand Council of the Chi Phi fraternity.
Oh, great.
And everything you talk about in here, it's an important book, by the way, because everything you talk about in here is true.
Oh, well.
Okay, and if we don't have this conversation, as I've said to my Grand Council members, we won't have fraternities in this country in the next 5 years. Because number one, they won't be able to get insurance. Because we're at one insurance company right now, a conglomerate that insures most of the fraternities in the country, and our rates go up every year and our coverage goes down because of these incidents. So it's so my wife often asks me, why do you do this? Why are you an advisor to these young men? And I do it because I had the great experience that most guys in my age had in fraternities. Some of my best friends today are still Chi Phis. So I thought it would be a good idea to help figure out how to make it work. So we went through the cycle you talked about. We were off campus for 5 years, came back, had a problem again, came back on. The next time we came back, it took us 13 years because the college was trying to decide whether they wanted to have fraternities at Lafayette. So it was a long struggle to get back, and we knew that if we did come back, we'd have to do it differently. And so we decided that what we had to do was completely eliminate hazing. We had to manage and teach people how to drink responsibly. And we had to teach people about sexual assault and consent. Because those are the three major things that are causing the risk associated with any of these organizations. So that's what we did. And so we may be a successful small experiment, but we've done it. But what it takes is, it does take adult leadership, local alumni who want to stay involved. And I just happen to live 7 blocks from the campus for the last so many years, so it was pretty easy. When we didn't use our fraternity house, we weren't allowed to use it. They used my basement. My wife cooked for everybody, and so it's been a very pleasurable experience to work with these young men and to help them mold them into more mature and more responsible adults. But it takes that kind of leadership, and it takes that kind of leadership from the undergraduates. So, as you know, the culture of an organization is determined by what its leaders accept and what they don't accept. And so the leader of the organization has to not accept hazing, And as a matter of fact, one of the things we learned this year down at National in our training session was that if there's hazing anywhere on your campus, it's a problem for everybody, even if you're not doing it. So, and there's small H hazing, and that leads to large H hazing, and then people like Tim Piazza and Maxwell Groover, and those people die. And we've worked with the Groovers, by the way, at Chi-Phi nationally. So I'd had this opportunity with you folks here tonight just to say, we have an opportunity at Lafayette. We don't have the problems they have at some of these larger universities, but we have to eliminate hazing completely from our culture completely. We have to learn how to drink responsibly, and we don't have to respect each other and understand consent, because we have to understand this is something the college can't do, but I can. I can say, I know you're going to drink and I know you're going to have sex. Please drink responsibly and have consensual sex. Okay, and that's what we teach. Okay, and we provide a safe environment for people. So it can be done. But what you're saying is exactly right. And we won't have fraternities if we don't change this behavior, or sororities. If we don't change this behavior in the next 5 to 7 years, it'll be gone. So it's an important book.
Oh,
it's an important discussion. So thank you.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, I feel like it's such a high climax.
Well, I think what you say is really important in that, I mean, one of the issues is definitely adult involvement. And I think one of the issues is that I think last time I heard it, something like 1% of fraternity members, because it's supposed to be membership for life, right? Only 1% of sort of adults end up going in and doing the kind of thing you're doing. And they desperately need more people to get involved, but also to represent what you're talking about, rather than in some of the cases I talk about, sometimes the alumni are just sort of trying to relive their college. You know, it's got to be really responsible adult leadership.
I had great college years here.
Yeah, oh yeah, yeah. And in terms of hazing, the big reform that I think should definitely be considered, what SAE did was, there's been so many efforts to try to stamp out hazing, and the problem is the sort of slippage, starts again or whatever. So what SAE did was say there would be no more pledging. And the reason they did that is that they found that any kind of pledge program, even though it's supposed to be like an education program, it sort of starts with education, and then you meet at night, and then you're like dressing, and then suddenly like you're asking to clean up the house, and it kind of this slippery slope. And I sort of described that in the second chapter about how it happens. And so what they decided was that if you have what Brad Cohn, the eminent archon, I think is the name of the president of SAE National, eminent supreme archon, what he said is that you don't want to have second-class citizens. So you pick someone for the fraternity because just like for a job, you wouldn't when you get in the work world, no one is going to hire someone and look in their references and then spend like a month beating them, right? I mean, that's just not the way you do it. You kind of commit to them and you work with them. It doesn't really create the kind of loyalty you want. So you offer them a spot and you make them full members within, I think they have 96 hours. And that means that there's less leverage, much less leverage. And also, you can't hide it. If they find out, for instance, that there's any kind of pledge program, any kind of initiation, anything at all, then they shut down the fraternity. And I think that's a model. It worked. Unfortunately, they had a death this year, but for years afterwards, they had not a single death, and their insurance rates went way down. They did that also by shutting down I think it was like 40 chapters, including some of the big ones. I mean, they were pretty tough on the chapters, but I think actually. I think that's something to consider, because pledging, it just slides to hazing, even though people, and the membership was furious because it's such a big tradition. But, you could probably teach the rituals, another way, You don't have to put people through a gauntlet, to learn that. So.
Just one last question. Okay. I don't know if it's the last question, but
okay.
I know you probably did some tangential research on sororities and all that. So just to know, would you sort of like parallel the problems, and would you say there's different set of problems that sort of address sororities as a whole?
Well, I think sororities are really different, and what I found really interesting is that sororities are just managed differently. You're sort of usually fewer sorority chapters, larger chapters, and much more control from the national. And I don't know if it's this way at Lafayette, but mostly there's no drinking, or at least no parties with alcohol ever at sorority houses. And there usually are live-in chapter advisors. And the result is that sorority houses don't have a problem getting insurance. You see very, very few hazing deaths. So they're much safer. Plus the sorority houses are much nicer. I mean, much, much nicer, no question. So that's, I think, kind of a model that fraternities could ban parties at their alcohol parties at their chapter house. They could have an adult living there. That would make a big difference. So it's almost a model. The problem is that, and I'm sure on all the problem is that sorority members then go to the fraternity houses, and the men control the alcohol, and they put themselves at risk. And so that is, I think, it sort of changes the power dynamic. So I think really sororities sort of point the way forward. I know there have been some debate among sororities, well, maybe we should throw parties alcohol because we'd be safer. And that's an appealing prospect, and it might be true, but you'd probably end up finding that you'd have some of the same problems, and your insurance rates would go through the roof, and you'd be facing existential crisis. So, yeah.
Please join me in thanking John Hechinger for coming.